I want to look at some of the people that are related to the Mises Institute that I've certainly learned a lot from. I'm curious what you have learned from these people and what you think their greatest contribution is to economics, philosophy, or history. What is the most important thing you learned from or contribution of Hans Hoppe?
Well, Hoppe is interesting. I guess it is the application of anarchist theory to maybe its ultimate endpoint. I'm not sure there's a ton more to be done in libertarian theory, in libertarian academic work. I think, you can go all the way back. You can go back to the 1600s. You can go back to Lao Tzu, and, you can go back to the levelers. But, fast forward, even in the 20th century, you had people like Morris and Linda Tannehill. You had people like Albert J. Nock, who was an anarchist. You had, Nozick, Robert Nozick, the philosopher. And then along comes Rothbard, and he takes all of these influences and mixes them together and says, not only is there a normative justification, not merely a utilitarian justification for laissez-faire economics, I think that can even be extended to things that we always thought that the state had to provide, namely national defense, police, protective services, maybe fire services, and also courts. No, we don't even need government for that. Even these things can be provided privately. So then Hoppe comes along and says, well, not only do we not necessarily need a utilitarian justification for laissez-faire, or even a normative Rothbardian ethical justification for laissez-faire, but just on pure logic alone, using argumentation ethics, we can justify a private or private property society. There are people in philosophy camps who disagree strenuously with Hoppe's argumentation ethics, and there are people in camps of philosophy and logic who think it's really a great leap forward. So I'll leave that to people. But I think, Hoppe took anarcho-capitalism, I think, about as far as it could go in the conceptual or theoretical or academic realm. I think we've sort of reached the end point. There's plenty to do in economics, but on pure libertarian theory, I think that's about it. So what's far more interesting today to me are the potential applications. Something like Uber was anarchic in its outset. They just sort of went into towns and didn't worry about the taxi regulations and didn't get permits and didn't tell the city council and just sort of did it. And before you knew it, people liked Uber. And of course, Bitcoin is an example of applied anarchism in the sense that people are trying to create a currency completely outside of any state or central bank system. So, these applications really interest me. But that's what I've gotten from Hoppe, I think, is just the ultimate endpoint of a private law society.
Most important contribution from Rothbard?
Oh, boy. For me, that's tough. For me personally, Rothbard is where I, as a lay person, have learned the bulk of any monetary economics that I know. Rothbard really demystified money for me, and I don't think you can do that purely by studying economics. I think you need a lot of history to understand money. You need to know the history of the gold standard. You need to know a history of banks and before central banks and after. You need to know the history of all those things like Bretton Woods and bimetallism. And you need to know the history, even before that, of kings and monarchs and sovereigns and their debasement of the currency. So I would credit Rothbard with my understanding of money, including value, including interest rates, because yes, I've read Menger, yes, I've read von Bavaert, but it's Rothbard who really interpreted that for me so that I understand money and value and interest rates through Rothbard.
Most important thing you learned from Ludwig von Mises?
Well, I think, again, his work on money is probably the most seminal thing. But viewing economics as a proper social science, which is theoretical rather than empirical in nature and praxeological in method, I think that's, nobody has done that better than Mises. I mean, Mises praised Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State on the grounds that it had taken praxeology further than Mises had. But my fundamental understanding of that still comes from Mises. And of course, the Theory of Money and Credit, which he wrote, as a young guy, not even 30, and wrote it back it came out in 1912. Just such a huge achievement. Still probably the best book on money ever written. Still one that a lot of people in free market and Austrian circles turn to. So, money and praxeology are the two things I've really enjoyed reading about through Mises.
And can you explain the importance of having a theoretical understanding of economics, not just an empirical one, where you sort of rely on peer-reviewed studies? Well, why is praxeology and the understanding of human action and its implications important for someone who wants to understand the economic world?
Well, this is a huge dispute. And of course, I'm firmly on one side of it. I don't think empirical work is what economics is. That's data. That's historic work. That's econometrics. That's math. That's statistics. That's all kinds of things other than what I would consider pure or proper economics. And when you say, what's the importance of theory? Without theory, you really have nothing. You can look at data and just see a jumble, right? I mean, economics is a social science. We have to start with that fundamental understanding. And a lot of people are critical of social sciences versus the physical or hard sciences. I accept that critique. I think there's a lot of validity to that. But nonetheless, it's a social science. Social sciences are designed to help us understand the world. The goal of the social scientists is to help us see the unseen, as Bastiat would have it. In other words, we locked down the country for COVID. What are some of the unseen effects of that? So that's what economics is. It's not a matter of observing data like you might in a field somewhere looking at birds, and then creating a hypothesis from that data and then going out and further testing that hypothesis. That's not how economics works or is supposed to work, in my view. And I really like Rothbard's analogy. He said, what if you brought a Martian down to Earth who had no context or understanding of Earth or humans at all, and just plop them in the middle of Grand Central Station in New York City at rush hour? They'd say, well, all these human beings are just rushing around because they're crazy and they're bumping into each other and they're in a hurry. This would be like some sort of crazed ant colony. So if the Martian didn't understand that what they were doing was catching a train home from work or whatever, right, that they have motivations, that they have a psychology, that they have axiomatic preferences, then that Martian wouldn't really know all that much about humanity from observing that. So, I think there's just a fundamental disagreement among economists whether this is truly a social science, and therefore within the realm of social science method, or whether it's an empirical or data-driven science. And I'm sure that from my own small perch, I'm not going to convince the empiricists.
What is the most important thing you learned from? I always get this name wrong. I think it's Eugen Baumbaverk.
Yeah, he really took Menger's work to the next level. He was more aggressive than Menger. He really went about building an Austrian school in Vienna. He was more systematic in his approach, and he also wrote more than Menger. Menger was supposed to write another book on method later in his life, and he was supposed to write more later in his life. He did write on method, but he sort of got depressed and despondent and didn't finish all of his work. But Baumbaverk really explains capital and interest to us. He in the second volume of his best known 3-volume set, because you got to understand, prior to the Austrians coming along, nobody really understood money, nobody really understood value, and nobody really understood interest rates. So the Adam Smith types, the classicals, said, well, why does anyone pay interest? Well, that's sort of the cost of capital. That's the income thrown off from capital. Oh, okay, but that was a little unsatisfying. And the Marxist conception of capital was, well, capitalists exploit people. That's how they get capital in the first place. They steal labor from workers. And then with this labor that they're stealing and skimming off the top, they turn around and loan that back to those same workers and charge them interest for it. So the Marxist explanation of of interest, charging interest, is that this is pure exploitation. And I haven't heard a Marxist address negative interest rates that we have today. And I mean nominal, actual stated negative interest rates on, for example, some Eurozone bonds. It's like, well, if charging interest is exploitation, what's negative interest rates? Is that capitalists subsidizing people? I mean, this is interesting to me. Subsidizing borrowers. So Bob Baerbock comes along and says, no, interest is related to time. And the idea that we want something, we prefer present goods to future goods, and that we have to sort of come together in terms of savers and borrowers and figure out an agreed upon price to get future goods today. And to do that, some people have to put money away. They have to save. They have to produce more than they consume. And that goes back to our earlier point with Hoppe and capital accumulation. So Bob Baerbock is a really interesting cat, and quite a character, and brilliant, very driven, and probably the least appreciated Austrian.
And as far as Karl Menger goes, with his sort of a real contribution of applying subjective value and explaining its implications, why is subjective value an important insight?
Well, it explains everything, really. And of course, Mises took that subjectivity and applied it to money, which is something that Menger didn't quite get. Easy to say in hindsight, of course. But the idea that we value things on the margin based upon how much of it we have and what an additional unit means to us is so, it seems so simple to us today. But going back to the 1800s, it was just conceptually a very different world. Economics was not a standalone discipline. It wasn't a field of study, really a standalone field of study until the 20th century. I mean, economics was just sort of bound up with logic and philosophy and history and all kinds of things. And in many ways, it's probably better off bound up with those things. I think it was maybe a better discipline. But so he comes along and says, nobody seems to understand value. Why is it that we would pay way more for a diamond ring than we would a gallon of water? Well, it turns out that depends. The diamond water paradox. It depends. If we're in the middle of the desert, we haven't had anything to drink for 2 days, we would gladly give up our diamond ring for just a glass of water, much less a gallon of it. So, value depends on the individual circumstances, which is another way of just saying it's subjective. And so everybody values things differently. Value is something that a consumer of something experiences. It's not really something that a producer produces. This is a new understanding we have now in entrepreneurship. That, when we say, well, why does an iPhone have value? Well, it has value because in the hands of the consumer, there's an experience or a desire there. And so we don't understand how different people value things other than in order. We can't assign cardinal values to things. We can only say that I prefer, let's say, a Honda to a Toyota because I looked at both and I bought a Honda. Okay, but we can't say how much more. I prefer, X utiles of Honda to Y utiles of Toyota. That's just, those kind of comparisons really don't work. And that's unfortunately too much of what economics tries to do. So generally speaking, we know that the more you have of something and the more plentiful it is, the less you tend to value it. So if somebody is dead broke and struggling in life, and you give them $1 million, or they earn $1 million, their life is radically changed because now they have a house, they have food, they have future security, money to live off, they have health insurance, if they have children, they now have something for their children like college money or whatever it might be. Okay, so from 0 to 1 million in net worth is a big deal. But if you if Bill Gates were to earn or to be given an additional $1 million today, his life would be largely unchanged because he's a billionaire. And so on the margins, an additional $1 million is, he values far less, presumably, than most people do. We can't know how much less. And there are some people who are just wired that no matter how much they have of something, they have 10 houses, they work, morning till dusk to dawn, to have an 11th house because they're just hyper competitive, and that's the kind of person they are. But what Menger helped us understand, along with others in the 1880s when the marginalist revolution happened, along with Leon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, was that value is subjective, and therefore interpersonal comparisons of value are well nigh impossible. And that was really groundbreaking, heady stuff at the time, and it still is. I mean, conceptually, it's still fun to talk about.
What is the most important thing you learned from Frederick Bastiat?
Well, the seen and the unseen is something that goes through everything. I mean, you see it every day. You've seen it so much in the last year with COVID. These politicians and these would-be doctors and scientists making these pronouncements about how things are going to be without any understanding of the unseen, right? I mean, you can say we're having a mortgage and rent payment moratorium. No one can be evicted or foreclosed upon if they don't pay their rent or mortgage, between now and X date. And that's been extended a few times depending on which state we're talking about. Well, what's seen, what's easily visible to us is, hey, there's that nice family down the street. They have a couple little toddlers. Because of COVID, the husband or wife lost their job. And without this moratorium, they would have stopped making mortgage or rent payments. They'd be out. They'd have to go live on the streets, or they'd have to go live with grandma, or they'd have to sleep on a friend's couch. And so you and I can look at that, and that's the scene. We say, oh, well, this very kind-hearted, compassionate government policy has made it possible for this lovely family down the street, which I like, to remain in their home. Okay, well, that's good. It's good that they're in a home. We all get that. But what you can't see is spread out across society is the cost of all these mortgage companies and all these landlords not getting paid. And that cost is not just in dollars and cents right here, right now, a year after COVID or whatever. I mean, that will ripple out through the economy in unbelievably difficult ways to envision for years and years to come. I mean, fewer and fewer people will want to be landlords, small landlords, because they'll say, well, what happens with the next pandemic? I don't want to be in this business of owning apartment buildings or condos or something when every time there's some sort of emergency, the government says my tenants don't have to pay. So that'll shift a lot of housing ownership and a lot of landlording to big private equity firms, to venture capital firms, to investment banks, which are already buying up lots and lots and lots of property because they figure they can get some of this stuff on the cheap. And they have enough money, unlike a small landlord, to ride out the moratorium. And then when the moratorium's over and, they'll raise rents, houses will be worth more and they'll make a ton of money. So that's just the kind of unseen distortion in just one little sliver of the housing market that will result from COVID. So, Bastiat told us, and some of our understanding of Bastiat is through the great Henry Hazlitt. We can't just look at the immediate effects of a policy on one group of people. The immediate effect is that family down the street is not tossed out. We have to look at the long-term effects on everybody. And the long-term effects of this moratorium are going to be higher housing costs. And so that's going to be borne by everybody. And there's going to be some other family down the road who's perhaps can't buy a house or rent a place because of this. And so that's how we have to look at things. We have to understand that every policy has ramifications. And frankly, if we hadn't had a rent and mortgage moratoriums, it would not have been in landlords' interests in most cases. It would not have been in mortgage companies' interests in most cases to just toss people right out and go. I mean, in the middle of a COVID lockdown, there's not necessarily a bunch of new people with jobs, meaning creditworthy, to move in. So it would have been in their interest to perhaps negotiate, maybe accept half rent for a while, maybe quarter rent, maybe tack it on to the future, whatever it might be. There are mechanisms that this could have worked itself out. And I always thought that a great private approach would have been to have these worthless state bar associations, which plague all 50 states, have all their lawyers do some free lawyering and sit down at, local city halls or malls or wherever people can get together and help negotiate, leases with people who were unable to pay. But, instead we had this moratorium, which is a heavy-handed, one-size-fits-all government edict. And, Bastiat's going to be vindicated once again.
2 more questions for you, Mr. Deist. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. Most important thing you learned from Walter Block?
No, Walter. Yes. Yeah. Walter irritates me sometimes with his endless lifeboat scenarios. What if this and that? I don't like that way of looking at libertarianism, because I think instead of trying to create a purely consequentialist system that's got an answer for everything, I think we ought to be a lot more humble in our libertarianism and say, it's not perfect. It's just better. We're not utopianists. We're simply muddling through. That's what human history is about. It's about muddling through. And rather than grand ideological or statist or nationalist, endeavors, we can simply allow cooperation through the marketplace to help us muddle through better in a kinder and more efficient and fairer and more just way. So that's, whereas Walter is very much in the consequentialist end of libertarianism. And I've started to have some disagreements with him on the concept of harm. What is harm in a libertarian society? I think in the digital age, we have to change our thinking a little bit of that it's not just physical aggression or physical trespass on land or physical theft. I think in the digital era, there are types of harm which ought to give rise to toward action that still comport with libertarian legal theory. And I think Walter Block very strongly disagrees with this. But what I've learned, I suppose, from Walter is, just the ability to make arguments for anything, because that's his specialty, and his, privatization of everything is really incredibly intriguing to me. And so I do have my disagreements with him on open borders, on defamation to an extent, and on actionable tort, what constitutes harm in a libertarian legal theory. But, he's like Hoppe, he's taken it about as far as it can go, and he's done us a huge service in that sense, in that he has forced us to sort of tease out and consider the implications of the things we advocate. And I think that's important.
Final question. If you could recommend one book for everyone in the world to read, you only get one, everyone will read it, what book would you choose?
For everyone in the world, I think it would have to be Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, because that book isn't just economics. I mean, it's couched as such, but first of all, it's very readable. Second of all, it's not ideologically heavy-handed, so it wouldn't turn off a bunch of people necessarily. Third is that it has standalone chapters, which, if read without reading the rest of the book, would help people understand minimum wage, rent control, tariffs, full employment. So that's one of the great achievements of that book, is that you don't have to read it cover to cover to benefit from it. And finally, he's a journalist. He's not an economist. Now, he's a self-taught economist. And a great economist, one of the great economists of the 20th century, but he's not an academically trained economist. And because he's a hellacious journalist who wrote, by his estimation, something like 10 million words in his lifetime, it's very, very readable, lively prose on every page. You're not plodding along. And it's very, very short. You can read it in a couple hours. So that if I had to choose one, that would be it.
Capitalism is essentially a system of mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. It pours a horn of plenty upon the common man. It has raised the average standard of living to a height never dreamed of in earlier ages. It has made accessible to millions of people enjoyments which a few generations ago were only within reach of a small elite. Thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Deist, thank you so much for your time.
Keith, thank you.